Hi, everyone. My name is Shloka Nath, and I'm the acting CEO at the India Climate Collaborative, a collective working to increase philanthropic funding to and engagement with the climate space in India. I'd like to welcome you all to the first event in our six-part series, Beyond COP26, Investing in India, hosted in collaboration with Edelgive Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies. This series aims to leverage COP26, which is happening in Glasgow next month, as an opportunity to bring together stakeholders across government, industry, philanthropy, research, and the climate sector to explore priority areas and solution pathways in India's climate challenge. Over the next 2 months, we'll be delving into the different levers that India needs to ensure low carbon development and highlighting fundable opportunities on the ground. Each of our events will zoom in on critical areas that the ICC has identified where further information, tools, and action are needed to catalyze impact, including climate risk assessment, green recovery pathways, and fundable nature-based solutions for carbon abatement and land restoration. Today's event in particular will focus on the barriers and solutions to catalyzing a just transition in India. We have all collectively been witness to a year of deep crises and disruption birthed by the COVID-19 pandemic. But as we recover from its impacts, what continues to claim lives and livelihoods across the world are extreme weather events that are not only increasing in frequency, but are also intensifying, with escalating and cascading impacts on communities and economies. The latest IPCC report only reiterates what is already unfolding around us. The climate crisis is not slowing down. And India is exceptionally vulnerable to this crisis. But we're also the third largest emitting country in the world, even though our average per capita GHG emissions are less than half the world average. This means that as we continue to develop on this trajectory, our emissions will only grow. And so we need to chart out solutions that operate at the intersection of climate action and socio-economic development for vulnerable communities. India is already undergoing a clean energy transition thanks to innovation in renewable energy-based technologies that have enabled them to scale and brought down their costs. But as we continue along this transition, we can't afford to turn a blind eye to the communities and workers that rely heavily on coal-based livelihoods and regions whose economies are powered by fossil fuel-based industries and services. How can we ensure that the benefits of green transitions are shared equitably with millions of workers in industries that are pivoting towards electrification, cleaner fuels, and low emissions? We believe that the answer lies in planning for a just transition, which will ensure that communities engaged in emission-intensive sectors like coal mining, thermal power generation, automobile manufacturing, and heavy industry, amongst others, can tap into the socio-economic opportunities presented by a clean energy transition and are adequately protected and rehabilitated during the transition. This session will focus on precisely that, bringing together cross-sectoral voices to seed the just transition mandate in the ongoing low carbon transition in India, to identify regional and sectoral priorities, and to discuss solution pathways. With that, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Mr. Anil Kumar Jain, the Secretary of the Ministry of Coal. Mr. Jain has held an industrious and illustrious career in national energy policy with over 3 decades of experience across ministries and departments in the state and central governments. We're privileged to have one of the most eminent and relevant voices in the country opening this conversation for us. Thank you so much, Mr. Jain, for being here and being with us during such a busy time. I'm going to hand it over to you now to start our event for this evening.
Thank you, Shloka and Shweta, for having me here. Good evening, friends, fellow panelists, and members who have joined in. This is a very important topic, and I'm very happy that the think tank community in India has picked this up for greater exploration. And I find many colleagues in the audience who are working on it to produce good reports, which are very helpful to us in the government as well. Jumping straight into the topic, I think India Climate Collaborative's a choice of this topic, investing in justice. catalyzing actions for just transition in India is, a very apt one. I like the word investing in justice because indeed a large cross section of society, which is involved in mining, particularly coal mining, they are not very aware, and even if they're aware, they don't have the means and the wherewithal to be able to equip themselves, skill themselves to migrate to the new era which is actually upon us. So investment in the stakeholder consultation and helping them, get their due share, which is also highlighted by Shloka, that there'll be opportunities which the green transition offers. So will they get the rightful share or not? Is a very big question. Now, first and foremost, we are talking of a just transition. I have three, four strands of thoughts. One of them is that this just transition should not deprive India of energy security. Well, I really don't have the present coal crisis in mind. This is a seasonal one, hopefully. Uh, but India does depend on coal for 70% plus for its electricity and 56, 57% in terms of commercial primary energy. Now, this is a huge number. And when you promote renewable energy, the another thing which is actually not the central piece of today's discussion is that when we are talking of a transition, a clean energy transition, basically we have renewable electricity in mind. We only have solar and wind and maybe biomass, but it is only electrical energy that we are talking of, which actually limits the debate. When you bring in a clean energy transition, you're also going to hit the blast furnaces, you're going to hit the aluminum smelters, you're going to hurt the steel industry. So actually, we are bargaining for something much bigger, but probably we are talking of something much lighter. So when you talk of energy transition, we must migrate. There's no doubt about it. I'm not here to propagate the gospel of coal. But in the total electricity scene of India, solar is right now 4%, wind is 4% again, and 2% maybe small hydro and biomass. And what we are adding every year is maybe 4 to 5%. And 4 to 5% of the total energy space is being added. So that is the growth in the electricity demand. And maybe that itself is not being fully catered to by solar and wind growths at the moment. Maybe we'll catch up with such large schemes that we have in mind for 2030. So timing of this transition is very important. So first and foremost, in the just transition, the people of India as a nation must get its due sense of energy security. Number two, the political economy. At least 9 to 10 states of India are involved in coal and lignite mining. So their ecosystems, the state budgets, their taxation incomes, their revenues, and the transportation, the infrastructure, the railway lines, the power plants, and the MLAs and the MPs and the panchayats, they all have livelihood related aspects. They have emotional bond. So when you talk of migrating and shutting down those things and shuttering them, and you have to keep in mind that we do not want to make enemies. We don't want to make just transition and a bad word in the people residing in those areas. So that is why your terminology of investing in justice is very important. We need to make sure that all the states, they piggyback on this great wave towards green economy. Otherwise, parts of India, many 20 years back, 30 years back, when all of us were studying economics and management and development economics, we used to talk about balanced regional development. And economics books are full of how, we had the uh, transportation retention, steel retention policy, cross subsidy in railways, so that the entire country grows together. So that is very important, especially for a democratic system where many states are ruled by opposition parties, and we don't want them to suddenly rally up people on some not so justifiable grounds. Thirdly, I also worry that the buzz around clean energy transition has created some kind of an uncertainty in the minds of policy planners, industry, and all kinds of stakeholders. So right now, a per capita electricity consumption may be about 1,200 units per person per year. So we need whole lot of electricity. The global average is about 3,000. In US, it is 11,000. So we do need large increments to the power system. Now, it is, you see, I look after a subset of the entire energy paradigm. So I will not, recommend what needs to be done, what doesn't need to be done. But the the day when renewable forms a substantial portion of our entire energy system is slightly far in the distance. So what happens now? I talk to investors of aluminium. India imports a lot of finished aluminium, and we export alumina. We would like that value addition to take place in India. We export a lot of pellets, iron ore pellets, and others. Why don't we do, value addition in India? So those guys worry that if Europe puts that, I think CBAM, cross-border adjustment mechanism, or something else happens. So it is for the country's climate negotiators and intellectuals to also decide what between now and then. Because even when climate change negotiations took place, they said that until 2020, there'll be a different regime, and post 2020, there'll be a different regime. So same is needed for India between now and a green economy. And finally, uh, what I would like to put on the table is that why cannot we have coal, also acknowledged and make it a part of the clean energy transition agenda? There are clean coal technologies in the world. You can mine sustainably. You can make sure that the power plants, because the power plants in better parts of the world. In Shanghai, I visited a power plant based on biomass. There was no stink. There was not a speck of dust anywhere around. Similarly, in Yokohama, in Japan, there is a thermal power plant where children play badminton on the campus. The coal comes, on a boat, and the conveyor belt goes into the bosom of the boat. You don't get to see coal at all, and there's no smoke at all. Now, can we not have, because the we are coal is an enemy to us because it spews carbon dioxide, etc. If we can do carbon capture and storage, if we can do sustainable mining, if we can put electrostatic precipitators and FGDs and suppress the dust. So this is something which I want, because why should the agenda be set by the West? Because when we want an energy system which is clean, and if that cleanliness can come from any fuel, we should go for it. So in the end, let us acknowledge that for a welfare state, the government has a trusteeship role. It is for the government in office which has to make sure that the transition, such a huge transition, takes place, and which doesn't hurt communities, states. There are a lot of studies already done that the coal-bearing states probably may not be the right candidate for setting up solar and wind infrastructure. It might still come from Western India and Southern India, whereas Eastern India will see, a destruction of the fossil fuel economy and importation of the clean energy from other parts of the country. So we don't want such a system to happen. So, and then what I mentioned, that with poor levels of education and awareness in many communities of India, the far-reaching decisions of this kind should not be taken in Delhi or in state capitals. And it will need a very participative role. And I'm glad that think tanks like yours have taken this initiative. So I've already, I think, taken a little bit more than the time allotted to me. My best wishes, and I do hope that I've been able to contribute to some, thinking amongst the people here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. Thank you so much for your thoughts, and thank you, Shloka, for introducing the session. Very good evening to everyone, and good afternoon and good morning if you're in different parts of the world. My name is Shrashant Patara, and I'll be moderating this discussion for the next hour or so. Thank you all for being with us. We have an hour's worth of discussion on catalyzing actions for just transitions in India. And as Shloka pointed out, it's part of a series that the India Climate Collaborative is hosting on investing in climate justice. This session, Catalyzing Actions for Just Transitions in India, in partnership with the IKEA Foundation. Before I get into a quick description of the structure that we'll follow for this session, I'd just like to share a few pointers on what we will be talking about. As the title suggests, we will be discussing just transitions. Transitions in so many ways are inevitable. Change happens and change will happen. I think the question is what kind of a direction can we give to change so that it is sustainable, it benefits people, it's good for our planet. And I think most of us, at least the people in this room today, and an increasing number of people, not just in India, but around the world, would agree that the present trajectory that we're following in terms of climate justice or our response to climate change is probably not sustainable. And we need to do the kind of things that will, for example, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also generate greater equity in society, lead to more development for all. And then when we're talking about a just transition, I think the overarching intent there is that of being fair, of making sure that people do not get left out. Mr. Jain gave us a few examples of significant magnitude of how India will be making a transition in just, for example, the energy space or the transport space, and that this transition will affect the lives of people. We need to figure out how we might be able to make that transition in a way that it is just, it's meaningful, it's long-lasting, and it's sustainable. If we look at where India is, it is uniquely positioned. We are, compared to, for example, many countries in Europe or North America, and a few others, we're very early on in terms of, on the curve, in terms of, for example, the per capita greenhouse gas emissions that we generate. And there are possibilities of designing a trajectory that does not follow that which was followed through the 20th century, but something that can actually leapfrog to more sustainable futures for everyone. And it's those kind of ideas that we'd like to explore today. In terms of how the session is structured, we'd like to spend some time with three of our panelists, Sandeep Pai, Mr. Chandrabhushan, and Amrita Agarwal, to look at barriers and in some sense also the drivers of the just transition that we'd like to make. And once we've done that and had a quick round of discussions on some of the points that will come up, we'll move to a second round with our other panelists, Mr. Jaikant Singh, Mr. Jiang Lin, and Ms. Suranjali Tandon on solution pathways. What are the pathways that we can take towards engineering, towards bringing about a just transition? So I'd like to welcome you all once again and suggest that we go straight into the discussion. And on that note, it's my pleasure to welcome our first panelist, Mr. Sandeep Pai. Sandeep is a senior research lead for Energy Security and Climate Change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Sandeep. In about 3 or 4 minutes, which is not easy, it's quite a challenge. It would be wonderful if you could share with us your thoughts on what might happen, particularly in socioeconomic terms, if we enter into a period of an unjust transition. Are we looking at winners and losers? Are people going to suffer? Because that is something that we need to be really cautious about. And in those thoughts, if you could just share with us who are the most vulnerable people, or what are the vulnerabilities that we face ahead, and is there thinking that's happening in terms of how we could align just transitions with regional local development plans? Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for this great topic and discussion. I think part of the grand challenge in India's case, and India would be a test case of just transition in my mind, is the scale of this problem. And so I'll focus my remarks on the coal sector, which I have studied more deeply than others. So coal, when I think about the coal sector, and my own thinking has also evolved, it's kind of like an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of jobs. It's an ecosystem of, categories of jobs. So there are direct jobs, there are indirect jobs, there are induced jobs, and then you have the informal jobs in the old coal mining belt of India. So beyond jobs, then there are pensioners. And then beyond pensioners, you have the state government, the national government, the railway revenues. You also have district level revenues in the form of district mineral fund or other smaller local taxes. Then you also have, investments in CSR. So that is to the tune of about 1,000 crores in the year 2019, 2020. And it varies, and most of this money is invested locally, in the coal dependent regions. So beyond all of this, then you again have, like Mr. Jain was highlighting, the array of industries, steel, cement, and coal is an important ingredient of many of these industries. Coal in some of the regions, whether it's, is also a household cooking fuel for very, very poor people. They scavenge and extract coal and use that coal basically, for household energy. So that is, the first sort of like visible layers of vulnerabilities that one can see if the transition is unjust. So I think the first step, which is for us to take, is to not think about, managing a transition as only a livelihood question. It's a public finance question. It's a question of how to manage sort of like pensions. It's a question of how to manage mixed use infrastructure. I mean, if you go to states like Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, like, coal companies have created mixed use infrastructure. They build roads, obviously, for transporting coal and for their own purposes, but it's used by the communities. So the whole ecosystem needs to be acknowledged, understood, quantified, and then any transition or just transition pathway needs to account for how one can take, how one can address each step of this unjust transition. I just want to say one more point about, it's important that while there is a big ecosystem, there are lots of opportunities, right? Like there are opportunities to diversify. So we are just finishing a large study focusing on Jharkhand, looking at various sectors in which the state can diversify into. So, it ranges from tourism to renewable energy and others. But there is a lot of need to do scalability and feasibility studies to see whether you can bring some of those sectors in districts like Dhanbad or, Hazaribagh, etc. Then there is an opportunity to, then there's an opportunity to invest in cleanup of, coal sites, which will also create a lot of local jobs going forward. And finally, and I will end, I know that I'm out of time. Finally, I think there is an opportunity to invest in capacity building in these local communities. I mean, you want the transition to be just. So you want the transition to be in some ways ground up. But you need to bring local stakeholder capacity in order to make this transition, just. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandeep. And thank you once again for in so little time, setting us on the path to discovering what might be possible. I think it's extremely useful that you've put the spotlight on the coal sector, because energy supply is, the biggest determinant, or changes that happen in energy supply will have the most significant implications in terms of whether the transition gets made or not. And then also the complexity of what we're doing, which is not, it isn't just a matter of difficulty, but it also opens up possibilities because you have a complex system at work. Thank you very much. And then the emphasis at the end on capacity building is something that we'd have to commit to. I'd like to now invite our next panelist, Mr. Chandrabhushan. Chandrabhushan is an old friend for many of us. After an illustrious stint, he's as a journalist, and if I may add, a researcher and an activist. Chandrabhushan is the president and CEO now of the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. CB, if I may call you for short, what do you think, if we're looking at sectors and regions, what do you think would the priorities be? Where should we place our bets? And what would be the key criteria, whether it's livelihoods, access to energy, finance, low levels of human development, that we need to examine much more closely in order to chart out effective pathways for a just transition? Are there gaps in research, for example, that we need to also look at? What is not happening, which needs to happen now?
Yeah, I think there are too many questions here, and I'll try and focus on few so that I'm doing justice to the answer. Not to the question, to my answer. I want to do justice to what I'm saying, because this is actually a extremely political issue. Just transition is not about simple technological and economic transition that people make it out to be. It is an extremely political, it's a political economic issue. It deals with political economy of regions. Let me start by saying that I find it very difficult that people are not discussing the time frame of this transition. People talk as if this transition is going to happen tomorrow, which is not true. Even the most stringent, the climate scenario, which is 1.5C, still gives us at least 2 to 3 decades for this transition to happen. So when people say that this is very difficult for India, that this transition cannot happen, we have too many problems, I think they're missing the time frame. I want all of you to remember what was 3 decades back. 3 decades back, we were in 1990, economic reforms had not happened, and you can understand what India was in late 1980s. And could anyone have had predicted what India is going to be in 2020 as far as technology is concerned? Today, we are about 100 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's what we are. And that has happened in the last 10 years. Now think, if the same rate of growth happens in energy technology transition, then what will happen by 2050? So I am very optimistic as far as technology transition is concerned. It is already happening. I and you, or government policy cannot stop it. The concern is that this technology transition and economic transition will move towards non-coal region, which Mr. Jain said very clearly, that the coal region is not going to is already not attracting a lot of these clean investments. It is going to southern and western part of India. And then after some time, the coal economy will start reducing. It will reduce, despite many commentators saying, including Sandeep, that this will be very difficult. I have a completely different view on this. This transition is already happening. In 10 years' time, you will see this transition hitting the eastern part of India, when people will not buy coal from eastern part of India. So the concern here is what happens to already a poor part of India, which is where coal is, when the coal demand starts going down. What happens to the livelihood? So I think the framing is important of just transition. And once we do the framing right, and then we will find all the answers. For example, framing on sectors. Everyone is talking about coal, but as Mr. Jain said, and Sandeep also mentioned, it is not only about coal, it is about all industrial sectors that are dependent on coal. And therefore, transition will happen for those sectors as well. We did a study where we found that if you map the coal dependent districts, it is about 120 districts. And of these, about 60 districts, which has coal mines, thermal power plants, automobiles, are going to get affected within this decade, because those technologies are available. Renewable is going to grow. Thermal power plants are going to close down. Automobile sector is going to move to electrical vehicles. So in 60 districts of India, you are going to see changes happening this decade. And then in next 2 decades, you will see much more impact on the economy, on labor, as well as social structures. So coming back to the last point of my intervention in terms of what do we need to know more? I think we need to know everything. We have only scratched the surface of just transition. There have been very few studies, and we need to study labor, we need to study finance, we need to study repurposing of infrastructure. We are talking about millions of hectares of land where fossil fuel industries and mines are there. We will have to start thinking about restructuring of economy. So this is a new field where, and as I have started saying, this is the new development agenda. That's how we have to look at just transition. A new development agenda in the part of country which did not develop. Eastern part of country, despite having all the resources, the richest part of country has the poorest people. We don't have to do this mistake this time. The new development agenda, which just transition is going to be. So let me end here, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chandrabhushan. I hope we get back to a discussion on some of the points you made. The interconnectedness or the downstream ripple effects, if you like, of the economy gradually moving away from coal into renewables. I think a few of the things that you've said were already eye-openers, and that underlines the emphasis you've put on how little we know and how much more needs to be done in terms of understanding the changes that are happening. I can see that a few of our participants have already started putting down their thoughts, their questions and comments in the Q&A series, the button at the bottom of your screen. And I'd like to encourage all of our participants to do so. We may not be able to accommodate everyone's questions in the discussion, but your inputs are of immense value to the India Climate Collaborative and the entire network of people that are working on these issues. So please do not hesitate to share your thoughts, your questions, your comments. We should move on now to our next panelist, Ms. Amrita Agarwal. Amrita is Vice President Group Strategy in the Mahindra and Mahindra Group. And among her many responsibilities, she's looking at how to scale up a portfolio of investments on structural reforms in public policy in the healthcare sector of India, working closely with governments, other institutions, and the private sector. Work that she's undertaken with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and has thought deeply about the kind of issues that we're discussing here today. Amrita, as a company, a forward-thinking company that's looking at the future, what do you think are the challenges that you see, particularly from the point of view of a leader in the automotive sector and the value chains that are linked to automobile manufacturing in India? Is this a transition that will have negative fallouts, or are there things that we could do on account of, say, the transition to electric vehicles and cleaner fuels that also help us fulfill that goal of engineering a just transition? Amrita, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rashdan, and thank you to the ICC team for inviting me to this very important dialogue on this critical topic. Absolutely, it's imperative to move towards clean energy and clean transportation. We don't have a choice as a planet. And this whole climate change is forcing all stakeholders to come together, the public sector, the development space, as well as the private sector, to think about how do we really grapple with this very complex problem. And this is including in the very space which we, Mahindra Group, operates in, which is the auto industry. We did speak about coal a lot, but this is true as well for the auto industry. And we have to also make a transition towards this new space on climate responsible vehicle and transportation. Moving towards EVs is not a choice anymore. It's a matter of timing when it will happen. And it has many benefits, not only from the climate perspective, but also from an air pollution and health perspective, which has many benefits to the society which we live in. And we have to think together, how do we work in this space, in this transition? Mahindra Group has always been a leader in the climate space in India, being one of the first ones to commit to carbon neutrality, as well as science-based targets. And we continue to be committed towards thinking about how do we transition to such a space responsibly along with the entire ecosystem. There are many aspects to this transition as we think about this. One is the transition from a customer and consumer perspective. As we think about, for example, the vehicle space, EVs, especially with the expensive batteries, may not always be affordable to the consumer. So while we are thinking about the ecosystem, we have to keep the customer and the consumer at heart as well. How do we make it really affordable for the Indian consumer? We cannot afford global price points. How do we produce at volumes and at the cost structures at which each Indian can really afford to own electric vehicles and be part of this climate transition? So that is a challenge which is very unique to India, because we do not really operate in the price points and volume space which other countries really operate in. The other critical element which many have voiced already is the supplier ecosystem. It is a complex supplier ecosystem in auto today. And with EV coming in, there will be a transition towards different kind of components, maybe perhaps smaller supplier base as we think about the components becoming fewer. However, that transition has to be seen also in the context of scaling up of this effort which needs to happen. If we think more ambitiously about accelerating the EV scale up, not only for India perspective, but also from a global perspective, I don't think this transition needs to be a zero-sum game. There is an opportunity for us to become competitive, to strengthen our production base and design base for countries like India, which are also operating at a very different price point in a different challenging market, which many of the global players may not be able to service. So I'm seeing this as a challenge, but this could also be an opportunity and need not be a zero-sum game where we are, only thinking about the negatives about the supplier ecosystem or the transition, but we should think about creating conditions as government, development agencies and private sector coming together. How do we harness this opportunity in climate-related, positive climate-related industries to sort of create a new GDP growth areas for India as a whole, for domestic and global markets. So I would say at the same time, there is going to be some transition pain, which many people have spoken about. And we need to be very mindful about skilling and other such initiatives which we need to think about in our ecosystem. The Mahindra Group also has a CSR program, which includes skilling and also has a focus on sustainability, especially with the gender lens when it comes to skilling. So we will try, and along with many industry players, to also help with this transition. But this is a multi-pronged problem, and it need not be a problem, which I was also trying to say, for all of us to come together and see how we can make it positive for us as India and as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amrita, for those thoughts and laying out the landscape, as it were, in terms of what the transition to electric vehicles would look like, and the implications that it might have. We're running a little bit behind time, 3 or 4 minutes, but it would be useful, I think, at this point to go over some of the questions that have come up in the chat. And I'd also like to encourage our panelists, if you would like to respond to some of them, then please feel free to do so. It's a great way of getting the dialogue going, particularly because we won't be able to cover everything. The numerous points, there are more than 20 points that have been made already. If we take the comments into 2 broad groups, one set of comments and questions are clearly looking at coal and the scenario, that we're likely to see, if not 10 years from now, then 25, 30 years from now. And across several of the questions, one of the biggest concerns was that of how people who have been tied to an industry, to a particular sector, to demand for that fuel across the economy would be able to cope, and what could be done about it in terms of responding to their needs and aspirations, with some fine points thrown in, which in terms, 2 of which talked about, who will pay for the transition. Would it be the coal companies? I'm not sure that's going to happen, particularly in a declining industry. Are there funds that have been set up? There was a very pointed question on that. Either of the panelists, if you'd like to take a shot at some of those questions, I'd like to invite you to do so now. Sandeep, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, these are all fantastic questions. I think the first question is, one of the differences between India and various other countries, including South Africa, which is sort of like the only, I would say, comparable country compared to India. And, many people compare India and then look at Europe's just transition and US, but the only comparable country is South Africa. One of the things that is really must is that we sensitize local stakeholders on the ground about the ideas of just transition. It's not so much that go and preach them about what just transition is, but it's like, this is an inevitable future, and then how do we design policies and systems which are ground up? So go and sensitize these stakeholders. That, I think, is a very important component of what we would do in the next decade. So set up consultations with unions, local communities, and understand what their priorities are in this, what Chandrabhushan described as the developmental agenda of just transition. So that would be my #1 point on that topic. The second is about finance, and something I've been thinking a lot about. I do think that coal industry will, if you look at a company like Coal India, it's highly profitable. So there may be mechanisms to get, lots of finance out of them if they are able to incorporate just transition as part of their institutional agenda. Now, bringing back this to this institutional agenda to the topic of non-coal and non-coal regions. Even Coal India, which is trying to diversify its business, is going to Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. So I've looked at all their projects, like barring a few gas projects, none of it is going to states like Jharkhand and all. So that's a problem. So we have to get Coal India to invest. We definitely need to talk about just transition finance internationally. Like look at South Africa again, like they're asking money for just transition, in this COP in provinces like Pumalanga. So I think some of those are some of the ways in which you can attract finance and make sure that coal companies pay as much as possible.
Right. Thanks, Sandeep. We might loop back to some of those possibilities in terms of what can be done a little bit later. Mr. Chandrabhushan, I can see you're unmuted yourself. For the next few minutes, in addition to what you wanted to say, it would be really great if we could focus on what's preventing us from moving forward in the directions that we like to go. What are the barriers? Are we getting stuck? Is there a logjam of some kind that we can break? That would be very, very useful for us to.
I don't think we have even started. So we have not started the process of just transition. We have just started discussing. I don't think the discussion has even started at the state level. Leave districts. So one, that this discussion is right now in Delhi and within think tanks and the union government. The discussion has not started at the state level, leave districts, as I said. So I'm not sure, I cannot even tell you what bottlenecks are going to be there. But what I wanted to say is that I think it is important for all of us to recognize that coal has not benefited the larger community in these areas. If that is the impression, then that impression is wrong. Most of the coal districts are the poorest and polluted districts of India. Those who have formal coal jobs, they are well off. Coal India pays well, and so does private coal mine. But if you look at the larger community, whether they are informal coal workers or they are coal gatherers and sellers, they have not benefited out of coal. Otherwise, coal districts of this country would have been the most prosperous districts. That's not the case. So as far as people are concerned, if you give them a better option than what they have right now, they will certainly move. And that's what the general feeling in coal area is. If you go and talk to a tribal community or an informal worker, this is the answer you're likely to get. That coal has not benefited them. If there are options, they will move. So that's what the labor issue is. And I think we should not confuse between the formal labor issue and informal labor issue. They are two very different issues. The developed country debate is on formal labor issue. How do you take formal coal worker and employ or retire him or her? That's what the debate in the developed world is. Our case is completely different. What do you do with informal worker, which is the largest proportion of people? And if you ask the informal worker, he or she doesn't want to work in coal sector. Let me say that right now. Okay. The second point is how do we fund it? We have a lot of resources, whether it is government resources, but the transition, which is a development agenda, will need these districts and these coal-dependent states to have governance reform to attract private investment. Sandeep is absolutely right. Coal India is moving its green investment in western and southern part of India simply because it knows that the governance in Jharkhand, for example, is extremely poor. So the transition will also require a huge governance reform in these states if these states want to attract green investments. So as far as international finance is concerned, South Africa can go to COP26 and ask for money. They're not going to get it. That has been the history of climate finance. And I think we should realize what is the reality of developed countries' commitment on these issues. And I think most of the money will have to be generated within the country for this development agenda. depending on developed countries to develop us is going to be a big mistake.
Thank you. There were a few very specific questions which we will not be able to touch upon right now, but if from among our panelists or any of the other participants, you could share your thoughts on the use of funds such as DMF or CSR funding, CAMPA. I think there was a very, very important question on making sure, or point being made on making sure that we don't miss out on the gender aspects or the gender dimension of an energy transition that is likely to occur in this country. What's happening in that regard? Extremely important issues. We are unfortunately running a little bit late, but before we move on to the next session, Amrita, if I could ask you to just share a few words, really quick thoughts on whether the change that we were talking about is also going to be driven by changes in the way people use automobiles, mobility per se. Are you looking beyond just the vehicles into changes in mobility?
So absolutely, Shant. Just before on the CSR bit, very quickly, I think there are some laws which can help strengthen the ability of CSR funds to be deployed for supply chain ecosystem strengthening. For example, we can't use our CSR funds directly only for our supply chain ecosystem strengthening from a just transition perspective. So I think there is some dialogue really required there as well. So just wanted to highlight that. On the broader mobility pieces, I think the industry is going through large-scale disruptions, thanks in parts to all the mobility startups which has come in, as well as some of the entrenched players like us, which have been doing on how people are thinking about transport. So if you look at other countries, in US, when I talk to other investors or companies, nobody's thinking that there'll be personalized ownership of cars. Both the used car penetration, which is people repurposing existingly built cars, as well as shared mobility has really dramatically increased. And some of these trends may not directly apply to the Indian context, but I think those trends are also beginning to happen both on the used cars, which repurposes the same asset, as well as shared mobility, which is rapidly we're seeing pace pre-pandemic, but will also potentially see recovery. So I feel like those transitions, as well as commercial vehicles being moved to EVs much faster than PVs, will have dramatic implications in terms of charging stations, in terms of economies of scale to move towards EV transition. So I feel like while there's many years of transition waiting to happen in India still, it may not be as long delayed, at least on the mobility side, in both in terms of end usage as well as the vehicle side as well.
Thank you. Thank you for those extremely valuable insights. We must move on now and move into the second segment of this discussion, where once again we have three illustrious panelists with us: Mr. Jaykant Singh, Dr. Jiang Lin, and Ms. Suranjali Tandon, who will help us look at the future. What are the pathways we can take? And without much further ado, I'd like to invite Mr. Jaykant Singh. We will have to keep our observations very, very brief, if you please. I'd really be grateful if you could, in 2.5 to 3 minutes, give us those valuable pointers in terms of how we can proceed.
Thank you, Sushant. I think the challenge is as big as just change in climate transition, putting things in 2-3 minutes. So, during the COVID times, we have just seen how oxygen has been important. Unavailability of oxygen has led so many lives in our country and the world. So we understand how coal and the other energy pollutes the ecosystem. So it's the need of the hour that we have to switch over to cleaner energy. We all have heard that it is important now, it's inevitable. So what are the solutions and what are we looking for? I can see so many initiatives being taken by Government of India. Petroleum Ministry trying to bring in ethanol, trying to bring in biogas. So everybody, NTPC moving towards setting up, we all heard from Sandeep. So all government institutions are trying to do at their own level, move on to a cleaner energy. Government of India has targeted that there will be 500 megawatt capacity in the country by 2030. My point is, I'm very excited that we have to move. There are 120 districts. We all heard that only 120 districts would be significantly impacted if we move on from a coal-based power system. But we should not forget that, and we also heard that most poorest districts are these 120 districts. So people lose their land in this district because they give up their land and they get a daily wage rate. That is what they get in exchange of the land where the coal mines are. So what is important is once we switch over, there will be no coal mining and these people will continue to be owners of their land. They will lead a much better life than what they are used to today. So there is no worry at all. It's not a concern. And all the statistics show that are poor, earning wise they are poor. So we have to see that it brings a lot of new opportunity when we move on to a clean energy. I believe instead of petrol pump, we will have lithium charging stations, which will make people more self-employable, which will have a better earning than what they are getting today. You know, people see the life of the people who are working in mines. It's so pathetic. People will lead a better life when you move on to a cleaner energy. You have land, you can go to organic farming. Will it not be good for themselves and for the country? So I only see a better future, a better life with doing away with the coal thing, because you will have a better way of, we just heard that formal and informal. Formal people, so I'm talking from National Skill Development Corporation. For formal people switching over to newer job, you have got Industry 4.0 coming in. New technologies, newer way of industrialization, newer way of digitalization. So many new work is coming on. People have to move, people have to get themselves skilled, upskilled, which is the need of the hour. So there will be no dearth of job for the formal people who will again be happy moving on to a remote area and work in a coal mine area. Even they are formal people, but they have to visit away from their family, away from the society, civil life. So no dearth of job for them. And for the informal, as I rightly said, they will continue to be owners of their land, which will be better to cultivate. They can move on to organic farming, they can move on to horticulture. There are so many new jobs which will come up. Even if we talk about solar or other better energy sources, you have got, we need an installer to install the new setup. We need a person who can maintain it. Again, batteries are required. So there will be jobs which are respectable. Nobody today wants to soil their hand and legs in a coal mine. So I feel from all angles, it will be a very good switch over. Even the cooking, it will be switched over to biogas. Why to go on cooking on a coal-based chulha?
Sure.
So what is required is a political willpower and a governance structure, a better governance, as rightly said by one of our panelists, Mr. Chandrabhushan. You talked about gender. I think women will benefit the most, because when you go from a hard life in a mining area to a better life, because all these charging stations could be manned by women. And even in organic farming, they could play a much better role. So I feel a much better future in times to come when we switch over. We have to plan ourselves better today. We have to plan the CSR. We have to do a proper planning. We have to do a proper analysis and study for in all these 120 districts, which will be highly impacted. Let's do a ground study of how many people are engaged and how their life we have to transform from a mining area dependent livelihood to a self-employment livelihood. And I'm sure it will be much better India and much better life for these poor people in times to come. Thank you.
And thank you for bringing the focus back, so to speak, on the people, because cleaning up the economy is one thing, but making sure that that transition is just is another. There were possibilities there that you talked about in terms of people finding new forms of employment, a challenge in itself. Without wasting much more time, Dr. Jianglin, may I invite you now to make your presentation? And if you could also walk us through, how existing assets, infrastructure, etc., could be used. What are the barriers, or how we could overcome some of the barriers that have been talked about? Be grateful.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to this very important event. I agree with all the panels so far that ensuring an equitable clean energy transition is actually essential to a fast and successful transition to a clean energy future. So I have a few slides to share. So far, I've been very inspired by the comments made by the previous panelists on the outlook to the future. I'd like to just share a little bit of the context with China and its history, how it's managing the transition. Next slide. This might be clear to the audience for this event. China currently consumes 50% of global coal, which is a very large amount. And only 50% of coal is used in the power generation. So the rest is industry and buildings. So it's not just a coal power issue, but also broader economic development issues. And coal use is unlikely to decline until after 2025, but then declining more rapidly. At present, even after a fair amount of restructuring, there's still roughly 3 million jobs in the coal mining industry alone. So this is a very large potential challenge. Over the last 5 years, the Chinese central government has established a transition assistance program to help move the regions out of the coal sector. Roughly, this is still preliminary numbers, the final evaluation has not come out yet. Roughly 1 million jobs has been shipped out of the coal mining sector already. Next slide. So the challenge, as we say, is rather large in the absolute number, 3 million potential job losses in coal mining industry alone, compared to roughly 50,000 jobs in the US. But if you actually look more closely at the age structure composition of the labor force, it is very likely more than half the coal mining workforce will be retired by 2030. So that's a very interesting thing to keep in mind, because understanding your stakeholders, who you're trying to care for, is really important. Next slide. At the same time, if you look at the projection for coal production, it shows it's likely to decline up 2025. The next slide on the vintage or power plant. Next slides, please. So this is slightly outdated, but today the average age of coal power plants is roughly 15 years. And if you imagine, at least in the previous experience, coal plant retire roughly after 25 to 30 years in China. So you still have some way to go. As I heard earlier, I think from Mr. Bouchon, that the time frame is very important, in the sense that potentially the coal's not going away, tomorrow. So you have some time to plan for, which might be one of the most important things to remember, that it's very difficult to manage large-scale transition, whether for economic purposes or technology systems, and as well as shifting labor force to a different sector. So you need the time to design and engage and find the right solutions. But what we observed actually in China, when I do my field surveys, is get people to accept the future is very different than the past. So many people, entrepreneurs, laborers, government officials in coal-dominant region often think about, oh, the good time will come back. To make sure that now, I think world has agreed to a zero emission future, the exit from coal is absolute. The question is, how do we plan for it? It's much better to do it now than 10 years down the road. So that's one of the key learning I want to share with this audience. Next slide.
As briefly as you could, so please. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So just a key 4 high-level policy sort of notions of how you manage this. Number one is really enhancing social safety net, retirement, healthcare, etc., because a large amount of people will depend on that. This is not just a social welfare program. In fact, keeping the local consumption steady is a key driver for future growth. If you lost local income and local consumption, it's very difficult to restart local economy. And second, for the limited funds you have, you want to think about the purpose of your assistance. To our opposition, it's much better to design your program for direct income support to workers, not to corporations. So that's not a sustainable way of keeping jobs alive. And third, think about your revenue stream, where the money is coming from, right? So broadly speaking, carbon tax and other ETS revenues can be a very healthy way to pay for transition assistance. Oftentimes, this is in the economic field called double dividend. You tax pollution, you pay the workers. The last point I want to make is that the retraining program really need to be thought through with engagement with local economic development agencies, the labor unions, so you would have a fit between the training program and the future employment opportunities, which is very complex because in the future, you're going to have a very diversified economic structure that the labor training need to support that transition as well. One of the few bright spot is actually ecosystem restoration services, right? So for many of the coal mining region, the ecosystem has been damaged for decades. It will take a lot of time, a lot of effort to restore them to more living conditions. So I'll stop my presentation now. I'd love to hear some questions.
Thank you for those insights and the extremely useful checklist at the end in terms of possibilities. We must move on. I'd like to invite Dr. Tandon now to share her thoughts. Dr. Tandon is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Suranjali, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I think I'd like to start at the very beginning and quickly sort of to summarize my thoughts that we're in the midst of a transition, and I think there is a panic to respond to it. And for that reason, we feel that we're short on time to say what's just, but I think we must take that time to say what is just transition for India, and all of the panelists before me have alluded to it as to what their thoughts are. And I think where we started was absolutely right, that this is all about India's economic policy as it has been in the past of balanced regional development. In the past couple of years, we focused on employment. And I think what I found very interesting was the document that was shared by the group. And it talks about 3 pillars in a way. One is coal, the other one talks about consumer, and the last one talks about land. And I think all are extremely critical in the just transition conversation, because I think most of our conversations focus on the supply side, which is to say that what will happen to the employment. But I think what's waiting to hit us is the demand side on the consumer, which has to make a behavioral change. So I think when we talk about what is to be financed and what is just transition and what is to be financed, I think we need to define all these actors strategically. And interestingly, we did a report earlier this year and we spoke about exactly how finance can catalyze, this transition. So I think of different players, and I sort of quickly go over these. There is the capital markets on the one side, which is known to sort of work for profits. But interestingly, there has been a shift in thinking on the investor side as to say that we should do what is right. And, assuming for the moment it is an honest intent, there is great potential for the investor to nudge companies to do better. Companies that are already engaging, as we've heard, on the CSR side. So that capital can be leveraged. But I think there are two important elements on finance which require proactive participation by the government. One is the central bank and the other is the public finance. The central bank is the all-seeing entity. It sees risks in the system and responds to those risks. And none of us are unaware of the fact that food price shocks, food supply shocks can shift prices in an adverse manner, affecting consumers at the lower end. And so therefore, the central bank can price these risks and lend to sectors which are in requirement of the capital for transition, as well as to make sure that sectors which are still very invested in so-called brown sectors are sort of made to pay a higher cost for capital. Being very aware of the fact that there are financial instabilities that spiral once you start using the carrot and stick approach through monetary policy. The second one is public finance, and I think that's extremely critical because about a fifth of our revenues come from fossil fuels. And I'm assuming now that we will think beyond coal in a couple of years and not just look at coal, look at oil and gas. And that would mean that so far whatever we committed on our sustainable development goals would also require a rethink as to how we garner money. And in this space too, CSR or impact bonds have made some significant headway. But I see the role for MDBs and DFIs to sort of bolster the role of government finance to pave the pathway for this transition. I guess I'm going to stop there and perhaps circle back to some of these issues in our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Suranjali. I think the point that you made on looking at the demand side and finance at that end as part of our strategy was of huge significance in terms of designing these pathways. I'd like to apologize to everyone, the audience, the panelists, everyone involved in this session today, because we've totally run out of time. Probably because I didn't do that good a job of managing it. We will need to close in a minute or two, and unfortunately we can't circle back to our panelists or invite any more questions from the audience. I do feel, however, that we'll find some satisfaction in the fact that we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at how changes taking place in the Indian economy in sectors such as energy, transport, will be of huge significance. And they will, to a large extent, be driven by the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, introduce clean technology, so on and so forth. I think it popped up several times, the question of time frame. How much time do we have is of huge significance. And as was pointed out, is a variable, but it's a variable that needs to be understood through a little bit more deeper thinking research that we undertake collaboratively. I think it was very interesting during the discussion that on the one hand, while we looked at the just side of transition, primarily from the occupations and the employment point of view, looking at how people would find jobs in the newer, greener economy. But there was also recognition that it's not just about employment of individuals, but we have to look at communities. We have to look at the assets that the communities will have or need to have in terms of natural resources, other infrastructure, etc., that could more collectively as units within our economy, the villages, small towns, etc., build a better future. My apologies once again for...
Shashank, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but actually I have some good news, because on the issue of time, we do have 5 to 7 minutes that you can take for the panelists to ask a few questions.
Wonderful.
We have over 31 questions that have come in.
Wonderful.
So I feel like it would be only fair. So please take the next 5 to 7 minutes to ask your question.
Wonderful then. Thank you so much. On which note, I mean, again, we can't go over all of the questions, but perhaps the best use of our time would be to for our panelists to share what their main takeaways are from this conversation, and from their point of view, what would be the most significant action with which we can catalyze change. Would anyone like to start? Ms. Chandrabhushan?
I think the takeaway is how we communicate just transition is going to be very important, because there is a danger that it can be misinterpreted for political gains. There can be wrong information that can happen provided to the communities at the state level. So how do we frame just transition which provides a right kind of information to communities to decide what they want to do? So communicating just transition is going to be very important. How do we communicate it?
Thank you.
That's my takeaway. That's one point.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but thank you very much for flagging that one thing which might be absolutely critical going forward. Mr. Jaikant Singh?
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I think there are 2-3 takeaways. One is awareness creation. As we heard Mr. Chandrabhushan said, we have started in Delhi. We have to take it down to the panchayat level, where the demand side. Again, the awareness has to be created that they have to change their approach and they should know what is coming as a replacement. We need to do a deep study of at the ground level. What would be the impact if we go for a change from a fossil base to a cleaner energy? And how what are the different types of livelihood opportunities, job opportunities which will be coming, and how we are going to replace both for formal and informal. And the third thing here, I would like to assure that once we have these 2 things done, National Skill Development Corporation is here to support and ensure. I would like to talk like Subhash Chandra Bose. Aap mujhe khoon de, main azadi dunga. You facilitate these 2 things, supported by the finance. We will ensure that each people who will lose their job or who have in the formal sector have to transition to a newer job will be skilled at their place in time and on time. So we are prepared for that. We will ensure that nobody gets impacted because of this, because we have seen, I come from Jharkhand, everybody talked about Jharkhand. I come from Jharkhand and a coal belt, and I have seen how people are distressed because of the coal mines, because their land goes away. So that pain is here in my heart. But we can give livelihood, we can train them for that, and we are working towards it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that commitment. I'm sure we'll remind you quite often.
I know what I say.
Thank you. Professor Tandon, I'm sorry we rushed you for time earlier on, but please do share your thoughts.
Thank you so much. I know that there's so much to talk about when there's just transition, so I'm not going to dwell very much, but just to say that, I think the key takeaway is that there needs to be a comprehensive plan, and to sort of acclimatize the government that just transition is not an alien topic. It's not coming from the West. It's a grassroots concept, which we've dealt with for many years in our decades of planned economy. And I think it's just refocusing back and looking at all the sectors, regions, communities that have been left behind. to say once again that if we are going to move on a new growth pathway, everyone's sort of included. So it's the mantra for, I guess, inclusive growth.
Thank you. Thank you for that note of optimism. What I heard you say was we've done it before and we can do it again. Dr. Lin, key takeaways from your point of view?
Sure, just share a little bit of the history and perspective from China's development, right? On aggregate, both employment and economic growth has been extremely positive over the last 10 to 15 years as China become now a powerhouse clean energy production, both in terms of technology development and installment. So the total picture, it's not a zero-sum game for sure, right? So there's a lot of economic gains for the country and for many industries, for many companies. However, there are areas of concentration in a few provinces that coal has been dominant resource. And that's a very typical challenge to get out of. One of the thing I mentioned before was really making clear this bargain of transition that's happening. It's not reversible, but we're here to help. But oftentimes, you need to find a balance between government, both state, central and local government, corporation, and the labor force, labor unions. Often there's an uneven balance of power in that negotiation, how the program is designed. So it's really important for the civil society actors to help the weak stakeholder in the process to get a fair bargain in the design of the policy and program implementation.
Thank you. Sandeep, one most significant takeaway, please.
Thank you. Can I say two? I had 2 points in mind, but I'll be quick. So I think the first thing, and this was touched upon by many people here, I think capacity building is really important locally because, as Chandrabhushan said, like many workers are in the informal sector. They are not necessarily represented by a union or an organization. So capacity building in these regions would be extremely important so that when they get a chance or to negotiate what just transition means locally, they have the ability to sort of like ask for things that they really need. So that would be number one. And regardless of the timelines of this transition, like anyway, just transition is a decade-long process. It's not that these things happen overnight. I mean, Coal India's first project is going to go live in 2025. So we are talking about one project. So these things will take time, even if that were to happen. The second point is that we need anchor institutions locally who can make these kinds of transition happen. So to me, a big anchor institution in coal region would be Coal India. It has been there. It has the financial capacity. It has sort of like the capacity to anchor some of these conversations. But if Coal India also goes and invests in Gujarat, then this will not benefit. So my 2 key takeaways is build capacity locally, focus on anchor institutions so that they can come to these regions and invest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. I think we have, in a sense, listed out the priorities for the future. It will, of course, take much more work, both on the thinking side and on the action side. And thank you, audience, for having participated so generously through the Q&A mechanism. It's unfortunate that we couldn't get into a dialogue. I'll hand the floor over now to Shloka with a word of thanks, of course, to the India Climate Collaborative for having brought all of us together. Shloka.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers, our moderator, Shrishant Patara, of course. Thank you for doing such a tremendous job this evening. And our audience, all of you who are here with us today. Thank you for being present for this wonderful and critical conversation, for taking the time out tonight. And we'd also really like to extend a big thank you to IKEA Foundation for their partnership and support in putting this session together. And of course, a warm thank you to the ICC team and our agency Ad Factors for all their effort in making this event a success. We are going to address all the questions that you have put down here today. We're going to ask our speakers to respond to them offline. So we will be sending those answers to all of you who attended. Thank you again for your generosity. I think Shashank put it very well when he said that you've been so involved, and your energy tonight is really what's made this such an exciting session. Our next event in the series will explore the opportunities for philanthropy to support India's green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's scheduled for October 25th. So we hope to see you there. Thank you again to all our speakers this evening. You were exceptional as always, and we look forward to seeing all of you very soon again. Thank you.